Hello, my name is H.A. Fritt, and I'm the author of the Anathalian series. And in this video, I am going to talk about an editing tip because I'm also an editor. So my editing tip today is, should I use that or which? And that and which have many uses, but this video is going to talk about relative clauses. When to use that or which when you're using a relative clause. And if you should use that or which to introduce the relative clause and how to punctuate this relative clause. That sounds like some crazy high-level concept, but it's really not. I'm just using the technical words. And so let's start with an example of a relative clause. So I read a book that was read, or should you say I read a book which was read. So you see, authors use these all the time. Authors use these a bunch. Almost, I would say everybody, but just in case somebody doesn't, I would say almost everybody uses these a bunch. They're really helpful for adding in descriptions. They're really helpful for adding in important information, adding in descriptive information. They're really important and helpful, and so people use them all the time. But as I've been editing, I've noticed most people don't really know how to punctuate, and that's probably because in older books like Lord of the Rings and Narnia, C.S. Lewis and Tolkien, they are from an earlier age, and they're like kind of British style, and so their punctuation and their that and which and stuff like that is totally different than ours. And I've been reading some of those lately, and I've seen that they don't use these modern laws that have come about after that help distinguish certain parts of speech and how the sentence should be understood. And so they don't use that, but because a lot of us grew up reading those, we think, I can use which whenever and however, and so a lot of people don't use them correctly, but it's not like because people are ignorant or something. It's because we grew up reading these books that hadn't developed these laws yet. And so don't be embarrassed if you don't know these laws. Don't be embarrassed if you're like, oh, she's my editor and she's talking about me. I'm talking about everybody who I edit, authors I read on my own time. It's just a common thing that this is hard to understand because we grew up reading books with different grammar laws. So this is what the grammar laws are in modern times today. It's 2023. Maybe my videos will still be up in like 2300. I don't know. But right now, when I'm talking, these are the laws. Okay, so the example again. I read a book that was read, or I read a book which was read. Which one would you use? So which one's right? First, you have to figure out the relative clause, and it's that was read or which was read. That's the clause that somehow changes book. The relative clause says something about that noun that comes right before it. So you have to determine if the clause is restrictive, and restrictive means necessary, or if it's non-restrictive, and that means not necessary. And so for the sake of simplicity, I'm going to say necessary or not necessary, but know that they have technical names, restrictive or non-restrictive. So if it's restrictive, if that clause defines which book, I read a book that was read. If you have in your story, a person has a big bookshelf and they pick out the book and they say, I read the book that was read, and is telling someone else specifically the book that they read, it's going to be a necessary clause, and you're going to use that, and you're not going to use a comma. Whenever the clause is necessary, you don't use a comma because that it goes with book. It's defining which book it is, and so you don't use the comma and you use that. If it's defining the book, if it's necessary, I read a book that was read, and you'll use that when it's a necessary clause. On the other hand, if you're just talking to someone and you said, I read a book which was read, but the more important thing that you're talking about is what was in the book, and it being read is just kind of extra information. It's not necessary, it's not restrictive, and so you would use a comma and then which after book. I read a book, comma, which was read. So I hope that makes sense. If you have any questions throughout this video, please put them below. If you, so far you're like, I'm totally confused, I have no idea what you're talking about, I'm an editor. I care about these things. I know these things. I remember these things. So ask me to be your editor, and we'll see if I'm a good fit. Contact me on my contact page. www.hapruitt.com/contact, or just leave me a message here and I'll get a hold of you. If you don't care about grammar laws, ask me to be your editor. But if you care, keep watching. Okay, so that can be tricky. Determining if something is restrictive or non-restrictive, necessary or not necessary, can be tricky, especially as an editor. When I'm editing my own books, it's easy to figure out because I know I wrote this. I know if it's necessary or not necessary. But when I'm editing other people's books, it's hard sometimes to know if they're adding this information because it's necessary or not. And so you have to look at the context of the full paragraph and think about, are they telling me this to tell me something specific? Or are they just adding this to give more description and more imagery to the paragraph or story? Eldon, dear, please don't do that. Sorry. Okay, so an example of that when it's kind of tricky to figure out and you need the context. An example would be, I fought the guard, that which or who wielded 2 swords. So if wielded 2 swords defines the specific guard, like you got a crowd of guards, you got a whole bunch of guards, and your character's like, I chose to fight the guard that wielded 2 swords. You would use that because it's necessary information. If your character's has a bunch of guards, it's necessary to know which one, and so you point out that guard. That is the guard I fought. And so you don't use a comma, and you would use that because it's necessary information. It's restricting the guard to that specific guard. Yeah, so no comma when you use that. This is, I'll get to my other part. Okay, but if your character's fighting only one guard, and it says, and your character says, I fought the guard which wielded 2 swords, that's extra information because it's telling us it's like necessary for the story, but you have to think about, is it technically necessary? Do I technically need this? When you're writing a story, you're like, but all of it's necessary, you know how to paint the imagery. We're not talking about imagery. If it's just for imagery, if it's just to help paint the picture, then it's considered not necessary information. So if you're fighting one guard and you said, I fought the guard which wielded 2 swords, you would use the comma and which. Okay, so that example, also, when you use a restrictive clause, you can say who. So you would probably say, whenever you're talking about a person, you would say, I fought I fought the guard who wielded 2 swords. Excuse me, my child propped up a paper against my legs. Okay. You would say, I fought the guard who wielded 2 swords. But the rules still apply if you use the comma or not. If that is defining which guard it is, then you do not use the comma. If you need that who wielded 2 swords to know which guard it was, don't use the comma. It would be like using that. But if you use the who wielded 2 swords in a way that says, this is extra information to paint you a picture, then you do use the comma because it's not necessary information. Okay, again, ask any questions you want, because I might also mess up my words whenever I speak. I've got it written down correct here, but sometimes when I talk, it comes out wrong. So ask any questions you need. Okay, so that's relative clauses. That's how to use them. That's how to punctuate them. So in summary, a little bit simpler. For relative clauses, use a comma with which. Do not use a comma with that. Okay? Use a comma with which. Don't use a comma with that. In dialogue, like I said, stylistically, in old times, people talk like that, and they wrote like that, and they didn't use the comma with which drives me crazy now whenever I read Lewis or Tolkien, and I'm like, but you didn't use the comma with which. You need the comma with which. But in dialogue, because some people just talk like that and use it improperly, I do too when I speak, it's okay if you don't follow the grammar rules all the way with that and which. Like if your character's talking and they say something extra and you use which, but you actually should use that, that's okay. Dialogue is different than prose. Dialogue is different than the rest of your writing. It doesn't have to be super correct because people don't talk super correct. And so that's okay. So in dialogue, don't worry too much about which specific word to use. And don't worry too much about the comma. Just remember, if it's necessary information, do use the comma, but don't worry so much about the word. That's kind of complicated because I just told you all this stuff. But basically, my thing here is don't worry too much in dialogue. And then my last kind of summary, simpler note is make sure your noun comes before your relative clause or the sentence can be confusing. So going back to the guard example, the guard with a brother who wielded 2 swords ran at me. So you mean the guard who wielded 2 swords, but you want to add with a brother, the guard with a brother. And so you add it in there. The guard with a brother who wielded 2 swords ran at me. And so your readers are going to think it's the brother who wielded 2 swords. Or wait, is it the guard who wielded 2 swords? So you have to make sure whenever you're writing a relative clause that you do put the noun before the opening word, the that, the which, or the who. Or else it'll get confusing. There are some exceptions to this. Whenever the prepositional phrase, like with a brother, if I said the guard with a feather in his hat who wielded 2 swords, then people would know the hat doesn't wield 2 swords. But it's still helpful to your readers to use that noun right before your clause. And so try to do that. Like I said, it's kind of obvious sometimes if you use that prepositional phrase. And so a prepositional phrase with or in or between, you know, if it tells something about like the positioning or with something, it's okay if you give that noun a prepositional phrase before you get to your relative clause sometimes. But just read over it and think if there is any way my reader could get confused about who this relative clause is talking about or what this relative clause is talking about, then move that prepositional phrase to a different place. Okay, so a better sentence would be, the guard who wielded 2 swords ran at me. And then have another sentence about how he has a brother. I wouldn't put the guard with a brother in that sentence because if you're in an action scene, you don't need this extra information. I would put it in a different sentence before or after that one. And so you can always keep your information, just put it somewhere else. That's part of editing, moving stuff around. Okay, so if all of that helped you, I'm super glad, and I hope you leave a comment telling me that was helpful. But if all of that sounded like Latin to you, then like I said, editors know this. This is our job. This is our thing. We know this. We enjoy doing this. It's fun for us, finding where to put the commas and taking out commas. So get a hold of me. I might be a good editor for you, and I would enjoy editing your book for you. So thank you for watching. Please leave a comment. Please subscribe to my YouTube channel. Share this video with others who are trying to self-edit their books, or who need an editor. And that's all for today. Bye. If you want to know more about Anna Thalian or H.A. Pruitt, please follow me on Instagram at H.A. Pruitt. You can find me on Amazon as an Amazon author, H.A. Pruitt. Please watch my YouTube channel and all my cool videos on my channel, H.A. Pruitt Anna Thalian. You can find me on the Facebook page, H.A. Pruitt Anna Thalian. You can follow me on Goodreads by the name H.A. Pruitt and the book Anna Thalian, or you can go to my website where so much cool stuff about Anna Thalian is. The website is hapruitt.com. Of course, you turn the lightsaber on. That's not funny. Why did you find that toy when I start trying to do my video? Here, if you want to, I'm going to put the lightsaber out here, okay? If you want to play with it out there, okay?